and welcome back to another Parry This video. Today we've got exciting new content to bring you. We're dressed up, as you might be able to tell, in something that is not my regular attire, and we are out in the field, quite literally, because we're actually standing in a field. And we're going to be talking about a historical topic that is of great interest to me personally, and should be of relatively good interest to you. And so, if you want to comment something right now, go ahead and guess what I'm supposed to be dressed as if the title and thumbnail didn't give that away. But if you haven't guessed it already, today we are talking about the historical archetype of the medieval huntsman. The medieval huntsman, oftentimes mistaken for the fantasy counterpart of the ranger, which is not actually a real historical precedent, at least in most cases. There might be some times where you would have a military scout and there would be crossover with some sort of an outdoorsman. But in real life medieval history, the huntsman was very common, and this was a role that was appointed by the nobility or the royalty, depending on the region in which we're talking. And this was a profession, so it was typically something that was a earned office based on knowledge and ability, and also political appointments. So if you were friendly with the nobility, it was more likely that you were going to get appointments like this. But it did require a lot of great specialized knowledge about hunting, tracking, woodsmanship, forestry, and law enforcement, which we'll get into later. Typically, members of this class would be part of the gentry. Sometimes, although rarely, they could be chosen from the yeomanry, and in specific circumstances, they might even be chosen from the nobility. But like I said, it was an appointed office, and so a lot of that had to do with who you know, not so much what you know. Now, the outfit I have on, and we'll get into the specific pieces of this, but this is an accurate representation of what you would see very frequently in the medieval period, specifically between the 1200s to the mid-1400s, for what a huntsman and or forester might wear. Now, the medieval period isn't uniform. So if we look at art, which is our main indication for historical clothing in the medieval period, a lot of times you'll see vibrant colors. And that will change depending on the era that you're looking at. There's a lot of reds and blues. But typically when you're looking at anything as a group, that is a hunt and not the hunt. So a hunt is something that would be guided by the local huntsman, or whatever they were called in the area, and that would be the nobility taking their friends and buddies along on a hunt. And they'd be looking for a stag or a boar or something like that. And the huntsman, part of their job was to know where these animals would be located. So you see a lot of these artistic renderings where there's people tramping through the woods in these very large groups in colorful clothing. That was an event. That is not indicative of the average clothing that you would see a medieval huntsman wear. Throughout all of the medieval period, when we look at artistic renderings, although we will have examples like that, the most common theme is dark woody colors, browns and greens. Very common for a medieval huntsman. Duties of a medieval huntsman would include things like, obviously, hunting, which shouldn't be that surprising. And that could be whatever regionally would be local, and it was for the nobility's table and or larder. So part of the operation would be providing that wild game that the nobility needed. They would oftentimes have rights granted to them, which would include harvesting for their own table. Now, these were not universal, and they weren't unlimited. Typically, it would be you'd be allowed to harvest a certain amount of a certain type of animal for your own table. So it was a perk that most people in the medieval period were not allowed. But the reason why you got such a good perk, as well as a residence provided for you, and typically a pretty good monthly salary, was because the medieval huntsman was a very busy person. This was not a do-nothing job. It wasn't playing around in the woods like modern hunters. You were constantly busy. So, like I already said, the most obvious role was supplying meat for the nobleman's table. But there were a lot of other roles for the medieval huntsman. Patrolling the local woods, typically any of the forests within the fief that they were assigned to, or were working for, depending on what terminology you want to use. They had to be aware of where animals were so they could lead nobility on hunts when they were going. They also had to be aware of any dangerous predators in the area, and they were responsible for controlling them. So if you had wolves slaughtering sheep or killing people, or if you had a wild boar that was getting particularly dangerous, oftentimes that would be the huntsman's responsibility to take care of them. So they had to be experts at not just hunting prey, but also taking out predators. But in addition to those obvious things, supplying meat for the table, taking care of predators, and leading the nobility on hunts, they also had things that a lot of people might not think about. One of their main jobs was actually policing the forest. A major problem in the medieval period was poaching, and the huntsman was the person who dealt with law enforcement in that regard. They had to enforce the king's or the lord's laws about who could take what. And now this is a complicated job that required a lot of specialized knowledge, because depending on the area, peasants were sometimes allowed to hunt or forage for acorns or bring their pigs into the forest so they could eat acorns and fatten up for the fall. There were certain regions that would allow members of the yeomanry and sometimes the peasantry to harvest small game like pheasants or rabbits, but certainly not deer in most cases or any other types of large game like boar. And so one of the main tasks of the huntsman was actually, ironically, law enforcement. They would constantly be looking for poachers, and this also leads to another ironic twist in the fact that what I'm wearing was not only common for huntsmen, but also common for outlaws, which is where the mythology and or folktale, however you want to look at it, of Robin Hood comes in. Typically, in the traditional tales, Robin Hood was a member of the yeomanry, who eventually turns to banditry, and we get the stereotypical dress of him looking a lot like a medieval huntsman. And that makes sense because he dealt in the woods. And so when you go into the woods, you wear what works in the woods. And speaking of what works in the woods, let's go through the items that make up my huntsman ensemble. And so starting, we're gonna go with the obvious things. First thing, of course, is a bow. This would be the most common hunting implement in the medieval period. That being said, sometimes a crossbow or types of throwing weapons, slings, would be used. But the most common thing in the medieval period was a bow. And we're not talking about a war bow. A 110-pound English longbow, for example, would be a very bad hunting bow. Most hunting bows looked a lot like this. This is, of course, a modern American longbow. It's a traditional American longbow, but it's modern built. And so it looks a little bit different than a medieval one would, but this is a good approximation of what a medieval hunting bow would look like. Typically, they were weighted right around 45 to 50 pounds for a draw weight, because that is pretty much ideal for hunting most game. You can easily take down a deer with 45-pound bows with a broadhead, and while using a field tip, you could easily take down small game like rabbits without damaging them too much, or you could use blunt tips to take down birds and birds' nests to get things out of them. So it was a very versatile draw weight that made more sense. And since huntsmen are more likely to hold their shots than wartime archers, you didn't want something that was ridiculously powerful anyway. So this, for example, is a 50-pound bow. In addition to a bow, most huntsmen, of course, would have a knife of some sort. Because when you kill an animal, you're going to need to clean it, at the very least. And if you were living in a poorer fief, where the huntsman job might include butchery, you might also be skinning and butchering the animals. But in most fiefs, especially larger or richer ones, that would be the job of a butcher. What you would not see on a huntsman, at least almost ever, is any sort of sidearm. So it would be extraordinarily rare to see a huntsman clanking around the woods with an arming sword on their belt. This is fantasy, this is not medieval reality. The only time you would see some sort of a sword that a huntsman would be using is if they lived in an area where boars were predominant. And those swords that they would use were called boar sword. If you are a fan of the game Kingdom Come Deliverance, in that game they have a class called hunting sword. Those are a very close approximation to what boar swords looked like. They were a defensive weapon to use against boars. So that's the only time where you'd see any sort of a sword being used by a huntsman. So the idea being you don't want anything that's going to be making noise or grabbing any branches while you're going by. The other obvious piece of equipment that you may be able to notice is quiver. So a container to hold arrows, which you need for your bow. All of this is fairly straightforward. At the time, wooden shafts would have been most common. I have bamboo again. It's another modern approximation using better technology and materials for the same effect. Outside of that, we have our clothing. So starting from the bottom and moving up, we have our soft leather boots. These were ideal. They didn't have buckles at the time because, again, we're just adding in more noise and anything that might reflect is something to avoid. So tie-up, low-level boots were the most common for medieval huntsmen during this period, especially ankle-high, in fact. These might even be a little bit too high for reality because most often it'd be about that tall. But these would have still been used at the time, just maybe not as common. The idea there just being the more natural your foot placement can be, the more silent you're able to be in the woods, so there's an advantage. After that, we have plain breeches or hosen, which is what I'm wearing. Usually, again, like I said, a dark color, green or brown, something that's going to help you in the woods. After that, some sort of a tunic, maybe a gambeson, depending on the weather and I guess how dangerous your region is. Again, dark colors, green or brown. Optionally, you can see I have a leather jerkin on. A jerkin serves two roles. If it's of a adequate thickness, they were protective, and so they would help against boars and things like that might try to gore you with their sharp tusks. A stout leather jerkin could help save your life in that case. But in other cases, and more common, they help against clinging briars or any other types of thorns from tearing into your clothing and flesh. And most importantly, and probably most commonly, they provide a great deal of warmth. So they're nice to wear on your chest to keep your chest warm when you're out in the weather. Moving up from there, you can see that I have a hood on, and this brings us to that aspect of it. Now, a cloak is again a part of fantasy when it comes to a huntsman or a forester. You would not want something long and dangling hanging off you while you're trying to make it through the woods, because that would just catch everything. It may be good for hiding in the shadow, but it wouldn't be great for trying to stalk a deer. A hood, however, is very practical. Namely, again, the main purposes of these are providing shade for your eyes and preventing glare when you're trying to see, especially in direct sunlight, but also covering your head, keeping you warm, and keeping you dry. Because as the medieval scholars would say, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. The only thing I'm missing, or I'm not really missing, but you may think I am, is a hat. And most people picture a pointed feathered cap that Robin Hood would be seen wearing. And that's not actually terribly inaccurate. The style of hat he's wearing is most likely based on a 14th century hat known as the bicocket, oftentimes humorously referred to as a unicorn, it having one point, inversely comparing it to a bicorn or a tricorn hat. But of course, the real hat, like I said, was called the bicocket. And this was worn, based on medieval art at least, during the hunt. So I could have had that and it would have been accurate with this outfit, but most of the art that I found did not feature it, except for, like I said, in mid-14th century paintings. That is the full outfit and the purpose of it. Like I said, there's a lot of variation in the medieval period. You might see many different colors, but this is an average approximation of what a huntsman would wear. And those pictures that you'd most often see of people tramping through the woods, oftentimes in 2s or 3s, a great example that I think of is in the first season of Game of Thrones, when King Robert is on his hunt, he had his squire, Sir Barristan, and his brother Renly with him. That is not a royal hunting party. A royal hunting party would have dozens of people. There'd be tents, there'd be hounds, there'd be horses. It's a big affair, not a couple people walking through the woods. But for a huntsman, he would often hunt alone. But again, it wouldn't just be him tramping through the woods. Like I said, a great deal of his responsibility was knowing where the local game was, so he could lead the nobility there, or he could harvest it when they wanted him to. And one thing that they would do is build blinds, or stands, but most often blinds, because it was something that was more possible for one person to construct. And this is actually a fairly close approximation to a medieval 14th century blind. Though obviously there are technologies here that would confound and befuddle them at that time, like weaving boughs. Of course, I'm mostly joking about that, but that is a American Indian technique, not so much a medieval Bohemian technique. But this is approximately what you would have, and we can go inside if you'd like to see. Essentially, the goal of a blind like this was, I mean, in the name blind, you'd think that it has something to do with hiding you, and that is true. When you're hunting, if you know anything about hunting, you'll know that the thing that moves most often is typically people's legs. And so the most important part of a blind is the lower cover. It hides your legs just in case you're fidgeting or twitching or moving your legs around. But it's also important that it kind of shrouds you a little bit, so it's nice to have a roof and maybe even some higher walls. The roof obviously also serves a double purpose. It does hide you, but it also keeps you out of the weather, which is an important thing for a medieval huntsman. When they didn't have advanced parkas and stuff like that, they were using woolen clothing to stay dry. So if you could be under a roof, more the better. One important thing though is they weren't hunting with rifles. Like I said, some would use a crossbow, but most would use a bow. And so it needed to be tall enough to draw and fire a longbow. Now, like I said, this longbow here is 68 inches unstrung. The string is 64 inches, so we can assume it's somewhere close to that. So you can see, when you have a roof that's tall enough so that you can draw and fire anywhere within it, then you can actually use your bow inside it. In fact, up into the front of this, it would be very difficult for me to shoot down from up the front. But when I'm standing at the rear, where we have the roof nice and tall, I can fully draw and aim anywhere out the front of the window. So a blind like this would provide you a great place to hunt any type of game that's territorial and predictable in any sort of way, like boars and deer. That's the medieval huntsman in a nutshell. I tried to make this video informative and yet not too dry, as sometimes topics like this can be, but it's a particular area of interest for me as someone who spent a lot of time in the woods and of course has a love and affinity for the medieval period and of course medieval history. So if you want to see anything like this for anything else, let me know. Keep in mind, it's much harder to make a video about, say, the average job and wear of a 15th century fully armored knight. That might be a little bit out of my range right now. But with that being said, like I said, let me know down in the comment section if you got anything you want to see. But in any case, thanks for watching and have a nice day, and we'll see you next time.